I'd like to now give the floor to John Ikeda from the World Bank. John, if you would like to share some reflections or some comments on one or both presentations, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. First of all, I want to thank both Katrina and Johanna for very interesting presentations. I think this lays out the challenge and the magnitude of what we're talking about in achieving the SDGs for water. What I was hoping to do in the next couple of minutes was just to highlight a couple of takeaways that I had from both the presentations, and then maybe you bring in the perspective from the investor's side on the water sector. Firstly, with Katarina's presentation, it's clear the SDGs are going to be staggeringly expensive to meet. And I think, it is important to have an honest conversation about, the magnitude of resources we're looking for in the sector. That we're talking about, essentially 10 times the amount of ODA that's going into the sector per year currently, just for CapEx, right? And that capital maintenance and then these costs around the enabling environment, the institutions to allow for effective rural water service provision are even more. And we have to make sure that we're not viewing the private financial sector as a panacea for this. Right? It doesn't exist to fill the gap, right? These are private businesses that are looking for a commercial rate of return. I think that's honestly the most important thing to keep in mind when you're looking at blended finance in the water sector. I really appreciated from Katarina's presentation, the sort of humanizing this and looking at it from the perspective of Omo, the water engineer in Ethiopia. These are this is a perfect example of how we as donors tend to focus on the initial capital construction rather than funding ongoing maintenance, capital maintenance, funding things like like the motorbikes and per diems that people like Omo need to do their jobs to make sure that these standpipes and other sources of water service are still functioning. Right? And honestly, I think in many cases, if there was more investment on this side of it, we would probably need less capital expenditure because you could see the usable lifespan of these assets extended much further. And I think the other important takeaway that I got from Katarina's presentation is around the 3 T's. And obviously there's a need for an increase in tariffs and taxes. Understanding how to make that happen is not simple. And I think particularly these issues around non-functional standpipes, around the lack of payment in many cases, right? It creates this vicious circle where I don't want to pay my tariff if it's not functioning, and yet if I don't pay my tariff, we can't finance the repairs in order to make it functional. And the final takeaway I found from Katarina's presentation was, the water sector lags far behind other sectors in terms of how it's accessing blended finance and taking advantage of these. And there is a tremendous need for more planning at the sector level in how to professionalize service provision in order to attract blended finance. On Johanna's presentation, it's just a tremendous treasure trove of data. And it's really important, I think, again, to note that in some cases, you have only 30% of people who are paying for water in rural Africa. And then even in the case of Kenya, you have around 70%. My own experience coming from the microfinance sector, there's a rule of thumb where if non-payment gets above 5%, you start to see a vicious spiral where people actually stop paying because their neighbors stop paying. And it is a question of how do you increase payment to a sufficient level where you can make this sustainable. And a couple of additional takeaways. I don't want to take too much time away from questions, but there's certainly a need for more data in the sector. We just don't know around non-functionality, around usage, and so I think the experiments that they're running in Kenya and in Bangladesh are extremely interesting, and we need to look at how to do more of this at scale and how to use it to drive investment decisions. And finally, I think there's a very interesting point around understanding variation, and data allows us to do that and understand, can we invest more in these high volume pumps and then have an honest discussion around the low volume pumps. Does it make sense to continue putting money into this? Where is the biggest bang for the buck with scarce donor resources? And finally, just a minute or two, on the perspective of private investors, right? As an investor, they're basically looking at four things: the scale, right? What is the size of the investment? What is the risk of the investment? What's the potential return that I'm getting? And then what's the duration of the loan? And, in the water sector, particularly on the utility side, even for large urban utilities, it's not the scale of loan that you would see, say, in the energy sector. And so there's a real need for governments, for donors, to try and figure out how they can aggregate individual investments into a larger loan. Secondly, around risk, in the US, for example, water is considered an extremely low risk, low return sector, right? This is where investors put money in when they're looking for sort of low yet stable long-term returns. And, in most of the developing world, I'm not sure that's the case. The finance that is available tends to be fairly short-term, and it tends to be a much higher interest rate and a much higher expectation of risk. And so part of the role of governments is to figure out how to de-risk the sector. And now I think a big part of that is through sector strategies. And finally, the role of donors, it's to understand how to leverage donor money, how to leverage guarantees in order to de-risk it enough to make it attractive for commercial finance. And finally, I do think there is a very important need for innovation in the sector around data and around looking at innovative business models that have been used in other sectors. For example, in energy, there is a revolution in Africa right now around solar panels, using a pay-as-you-go or a leasing model that has made it a lot more accessible to a lot more people. And so, there's quite frankly a number of lessons that can be learned from that, as well as in other areas. And my hope is that that will help expand access and tap into the commercial financial sector more effectively.